Member representing Bende Federal Constituency. Mr. Speaker, so I'm from Abia State. Mr. Speaker, I must thank the authors of this bill for bringing to the fore, of course, to the discourse, the need for us to take another cursory look at the Electoral Act and the electoral processes that are the bastion of our nation's democracy. Mr. Speaker, so everybody says that elections are the beginning of democracy, but they do not necessarily guarantee democracy. It's just the beginning. But, Mr. Speaker, the part of this bill that I particularly want to speak to is the fact that has to do with diaspora voting. Mr. Speaker, I recognize that indeed it is the civic responsibility of every citizen of a country to be part of an electoral process. Mr. Speaker, I also recognize that the reason why they say that democracy is the most desirable mode of governance is that it gives the people the opportunity to choose their leaders and indeed hold their leaders accountable because of that choice. Mr. Speaker, I also recognize the fact that it is desirable for every citizen to be able to say that he holds in trust, that they elect the people who hold in trust the standard bearers of their collective intention. But, Mr. Speaker, I have a concern with that aspect of the bill. And the reason is, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be anecdotal here, that we just came back from South Africa on this trip, and if you read the news or if you listen, depending on who spoke, there were either 600,000 Nigerians or 700,000 Nigerians or 800,000 Nigerians, depending on who it was that spoke and depending on the reportage and how it was read. And so it goes back to the very basics, that even as we speak, Mr. Speaker, we don't have a database of the number of Nigerians that reside outside of this country. Mr. Speaker, I think that logistically, we also as a country have recognized that in the last couple of elections, there's a new word that has been introduced to the Nigerian lexicon, and it's called inconclusive elections. Mr. Speaker, all these elections are inconclusive when the logistical issues are very small. We just have to go to the polling units, collate, and come back. And yet we have not been able to get it right. Mr. Speaker, it is my belief that we cannot legislate diaspora voting into being. I believe that INEC must come and tell us if they have the building blocks, if they have the architecture that is ready, if they have the basics, the foundation that is, that we can build this architecture upon for us to have diaspora voting. I think that the database, INEC's preparedness, engagements between an INEC desk, for instance, in the diaspora and the embassies, the ability to communicate very seamlessly and in quick time with the embassies is another thing. And, Mr. Speaker, so I don't see that the infrastructural framework is here. So while it's desirable, I'm hoping that, of course, Honorable Aisha Duku would enlighten us and tell us the level of preparedness of INEC, so that we don't legislate into being, because they say over legislation is as bad as under legislation, so that we don't legislate something that we cannot follow up and then, of course, have even more inconclusive elections. So to that end, Mr. Speaker, while I recognize the fact that it is desirable for every Nigerian, in spite of where he lives, to be part of our electoral process, I also think that before we put the cart before the horse, that we should find out exactly the desirability and the ability for us to actually walk this talk before we start to legislate into being something that may not be in our immediate future. Thank you.
Honorable Wale